Hello and welcome to a very special episode of ET Insight, where we get you a 360-degree view of what you can expect from Budget 2012. I'm Sridhar Ramakrishnan, and here's what we have for you on the show today. It's a make or break situation for the Indian economy. So what will Finance Minister Pranab Mukherjee pull out of his bag this year? Will Budget 2012 revive India's economy or put the brakes on growth? And find out what the government must do to set India's economic engine humming once again. Our top story first. 2011 was a bad year for the Indian economy. A falling rupee, uncontrollably high inflation, rising fiscal and current account deficits, and a policy paralysis in New Delhi made investors wary of investing in the country. With general elections coming up in 2014, this year's budget is the UPA government's last opportunity to push for reforms and bring the economy back on track. Nikhil Shudas tells you what you can expect from the budget this year and why.
Time is running out for the Indian economy, and the government needs to move fast to push growth back on track. To start with, it needs to put its own house in order.
The last opportunity to put your fiscal house in order is 2012. So, when you say politics, this is politics. Tough budget is also politics. So I think in terms of the electoral cycle, this needs to be a tough budget. You need to say that whatever I do this time, let there be a kind of hoo-ha. Because only if I keep it tight this year will I be able to suddenly give a lot of goodies in 2013.
A tight budget is important. India's fiscal deficit is getting out of hand. By the end of January, the government was running a fiscal deficit of 4.34 lakh crore rupees. Experts say that's far above the budgeted estimate of 4.6% of GDP. According to Standard Chartered, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, India's fiscal deficit could well range between 5.8 to 6.2% of GDP. And this excessive debt is taking a heavy toll on the economy.
We shall have to manage growth and moderate inflationary pressures and also the path of fiscal consolidation. No doubt these are the challenging tasks.
The reason for these challenges are obvious. The government is spending far more than it collects and has been unable to even meet its disinvestment target of 40,000 crore rupees this year. Until January this year, tax collections grew by 12% compared to the government's budgeted estimates of 18%. Total expenditure, on the other hand, grew by a whopping 13% compared to the government's estimate of 3%. 90% of this gap is filled through market borrowings. The government has exceeded its borrowing target of 4.17 lakh crore rupees by 92,000 crore rupees this year. It's important to control the fiscal deficit because unbridled borrowing by the government can hurt private sector investment and consumption.
There is an urgent need for decisive fiscal consolidation, which will shift the balance of aggregate demand from public to private and from consumption to capital formation. This is critical to yielding the space required for lowering rates without the imminent risk of resurgent inflation. The forthcoming union budget must exploit the opportunity to begin the process in a credible and sustainable way.
The credible and sustainable way ahead is to reduce spending and increase revenues. Let's first address the problems from the expenditure point of view. A report by Goldman Sachs estimates that up to 22% of the increase in the fiscal deficit is directly due to unbudgeted subsidy increases. Last year, the government stated that its spend on subsidies would fall by 12.5%. The outcome has been anything but that. According to a Deutsche Bank report, the subsidy bill for three key items, that is food, fertilizers and petroleum in the past year, could touch 290,000 crore rupees or 3.3% of GDP as opposed to the budgeted target of 134,200 crore rupees or 1.5% of GDP. A look at the breakup of the three subsidies reveals more. Petroleum accounts for the largest part of the government's unplanned subsidy expenditure, followed by fertilizers and food. With the government looking to push the food bill next year, chances are that this subsidy could rise even further. The issue was quite firmly addressed by the Prime Minister in his New Year message this year.
This issue was quite firmly addressed by the Prime Minister in his New Year's message, and he did say
that, in the case of food subsidy, clearly, as a conscious decision, we're going to bear a little bit more of a burden, but that means that other subsidies have to be contained. He did talk about energy subsidies, which are excessive. Now, we're not in a position to outline right now what the government intends to do, but I would hope that during the course of the next few months, we would get a clear signal of what steps are being taken to reduce other subsidies.
From subsidies to other social welfare schemes like Narega, the Indira Awas Yojana and the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. The government is estimated to have spent 700,000 crore rupees on the top flagship rural development and poverty alleviation programs during the 11th five-year plan. The number of centrally sponsored schemes increased from an all-time low of 99 in 2007 and 8 to 147 schemes this year. A large number of these programs overlap, leading to waste and leakage in the system. A recent report by the Planning Commission has asked that the government consider scrapping or merging all centrally sponsored schemes with an annual outlay of less than 300 crore rupees and bringing the total number of government schemes down from 147 to a more manageable 59.
The point is that if you have a small schemes operating, then as you take up new schemes and as times develop and new developments take place, old schemes don't get scrapped, and therefore you have a large number of schemes on which funds are getting used, and they're really not in a very productive manner.
So on the expenditure front, here's what can be expected from Budget 2012. A reduction in the number of welfare schemes, an increase in the prices of diesel, kerosene and cooking oil in order to cut the fuel subsidy bill, and a reduction in the fertilizer bill by linking the price of urea to the price of gas. But containing expenses will not be the only focus of the government in this budget. Increasing revenues will be the other focus area. The government is expected to raise excise duties and the service tax by 200 basis points. That's not all. It's also expected to widen the coverage of service tax via a negative list, which highlights services that are tax exempt. Every other service will be covered and hence taxed. It's also likely to introduce some provisions of the proposed direct tax code and the goods and services tax. For instance, the government may bring transactions between foreign companies involving Indian assets under the tax radar. To drive up revenues, the government may also withdraw incentives that were introduced to tide over the 2008 economic crisis.
In the context of the international financial crisis, we brought down certain rates, and therefore it is nearly 2-3 years since the crisis erupted, and therefore we really need to look at those rates. Therefore, the possibility of going back to the pre-crisis levels of tax to GDP ratio is extremely important, because that level of tax revenue is needed in order to meet the expanding expenditures. Therefore, the analysis will have to be in terms of how to go back to the pre-crisis level of tax GDP ratio.
Budget 2012 is expected to keep the corporate tax rate at the current level of 30%, but the finance minister will not stop wooing the Aam Aadmi. Chances are that personal income tax rates may come down a little. A parliamentary committee has reportedly recommended restructuring tax slabs, with income of 2 to 5 lakh rupees being taxed at 10%, 5 to 10 lakh rupees at 20%, and income about 10 lakh rupees at 30%. That's not all. The Finance Ministry is also reportedly set to increase the maximum exemption limit from 1,80,000 to 2,50,000 so as to provide the low-income earning group with more disposable income. But don't expect too many dramatic changes on the tax front, because whatever streamlining the government wants to do is already proposed in the direct tax code and the goods and services tax, both of which await implementation. From raising tax collections to selling assets, the government can raise additional funds quickly by auctioning national assets like spectrum and natural resources like coal blocks. The 3G license auction saw the government rake in over 70,000 crore rupees. But experts say that the forthcoming 2G auction is unlikely to be as successful. And the government does not have the best record as far as its approach on the sale of natural resources like gas, coal and mines is concerned. Enter policy reforms. The government realizes that, but its hands are tied.
You try to build a consensus. In my view, we had built a broad-based consensus, but our political opponents in particular had the reservations. I can understand the left front because of the ideological blinkers, and the BJP for partisan politics.
The other way to raise funds is via disinvestment of public sector enterprises. But if the recent experience with ONGC is anything to go by, then the government will have to do a lot more to attract investors. The government is actively looking at other ways and means to divest its stake in public sector enterprises. This includes allowing PSUs to buy back shares.
The buyback policy is that the company have to take a call, the board of directors have to take a call whether they want to go to the route of buyback so that the valuation of company shares increases.
If one company wants to buy the shares of another company, that flexibility should be available. I mean, it could happen in the private sector. Why not in the public sector?
The priorities for the government are clear. But will these measures be enough to get the economy back on track? Well, these measures are not nearly enough, but they are a step in the right direction. What the government really needs to address is the real problem, policy paralysis. And this may well be the government's last chance to do so, considering that the next year's budget will be a non-event, as it will be presented just before the next general elections. And that means that Budget 2012 will decide whether India will sparkle as the rising star of the East or fade away into the long dark night.
Indeed. So what are the policy measures that could pull India out of this slowdown? That story is coming up after this break. Stay with us.